Good afternoon. This is Michelle Young. I'm the Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration with the UCEA webinar series on educational leadership. We will be discussing today an innovative tool for educational leadership which was developed and is now offered by the University of Wisconsin's Center for Education Products and Services. It's called the Comprehensive Assessment of Leadership for Learning, and it's also called CALL. The CALL is a cloud-based school leadership assessment, and it's school-wide. It provides a feedback system, and rather than focusing on individual school leaders, the CALL utilizes a multi-source comprehensive survey to assess core leadership practices that are distributed across a school building. Upon completion of the survey, users receive an automated targeted data and feedback designed to support school-wide improvement and professional growth. The CALL offers a lot of benefits, not just to practitioners, but also to researchers and pre-service school leaders. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the research and preparation uses of the CALL, along with the data gathered by the assessment system. Joining us today are three individuals who worked very closely with CALL. And there we go. The first is Mark Blitz, who is the CALL Project Director for the Wisconsin Center for Education Products and Services. We also have Jennifer Michnow, who is a clinical instructor and program coordinator for LEAD Connecticut UCAPP Residency program. And finally, we have Dr. Marcia Modesti, who is an assistant professor of education at Penn State University. On behalf of UCEA, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the three of you, and thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you, Michelle. Looking forward to this.
Thank you as well.
So one quick programming note before we begin. We will be monitoring the question and chat features of the web platform. Should you have any questions for me or for our presenters, please do submit them, and we will make every attempt to address them in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We will not be unmuting the folks who are participating as attendees. Instead, we'd like for you to submit your question in the question box. Please do take advantage of this opportunity. Also, we wanted to let you know that we will be recording this session, so if you happen to miss something and would like a repeat, you can definitely watch the video when it's loaded up onto YouTube next week. Now, with those announcements, I'd like to begin. Before moving into the specifics of the webinar, the research and the use of CALL within preparation programs, we thought it would be helpful to get a little bit more background about the CALL itself. So we've asked Mark Blitz if he would tell us a little bit more about this school-wide leadership assessment and the feedback system that they developed. So Mark, how is this survey different from other leadership assessment tools?
Well, great. Thanks, Michelle. I'm looking forward to talking about that question specifically and in general about CALL. And I think when we start to talk about CALL and what makes it unique, I think it's good to start kind of at the beginning of just kind of take a step back and think about school leadership research in general. And we begin with this idea that we find a lot in school leadership research that, of course, effective school leadership is actually a rather important aspect or factor of advancing and supporting student learning. But when we're talking about leadership in this context, we're talking about leadership here as a function and not necessarily just one singular leader. And of course, we'd like leadership in our schools to be effective. And we'd like to find ways to make it more effective if possible. So that's one of our principles in the use and development of CALL. The other is this, I would say, misconception that's been somewhat perpetuated by popular culture and mainstream media that the principal in a school is some sort of superhero that can turn things around just by her or himself. And as it happens, we were discussing earlier, today happens to be National Superhero Day. So wonderful for superheroes, but not necessarily for the reality that it is the principalship. Because in reality, the leadership in a school is not just the result of one singular person. It's not just the result of one person entering a school and turn things around by her or himself. In reality, in actuality, if you wanted to study or support or measure leadership in a school, and you only focused on that one singular principal in a school, you'd be missing a lot of what else is going on throughout the school building. And that actually, effective school leadership is the result of various people in a school organization taking on responsibilities and interacting with each other. And the principal is not doing every single one of the key instructional leadership tasks that we find in schools. Oftentimes, the principal acts as more of an orchestra conductor who's organizing the work in schools, making sure everything is happening effectively, efficiently, or harmoniously, to extend the metaphor here. And this is the idea of distributed leadership. That leadership is not the result of just one person. And if we wanted to assess leadership in a school, we should look beyond just what the principal is and what the principal is doing. And that really is the foundation behind the comprehensive assessment of leadership for learning, or CALL. So Michelle introduced this obviously at the beginning and did a fine job. So we can talk a little bit more about what this is by looking at some of the key aspects of what CALL is. So CALL is an online formative assessment and feedback system designed to measure school-wide distributed leadership. So what exactly does all that mean? Well, let's look at some of the key features here of what makes up this instrument. First, CALL begins with a multi-source survey. So we'd have all the teachers and all the administrators and all the instructional support staff in a school responding to questions on a survey about key instructional leadership practices. And that's the key here. The survey is focused on leadership tasks. So rather than focusing on a singular person, and regardless of who's actually doing this work, we want to know how effective is that work. And so we're focusing on the routines, the tasks, the activities that are occurring consistently in a school. Then when the survey is complete, the school leaders have access to the formative feedback system, which provides data, targeted data, to support their work for school improvement. And because the survey items on CALL are focused on tasks, the data that comes out of this is action-oriented. It allows people to focus on work that they need to be doing or could be doing in their schools. So, what then does CALL actually measure in a school? Well, there are 5 core domains in CALL. Domain 1 is focus on learning, which looks at how school leaders maintaining a school-wide focus on learning, how they prioritize the support of all students in the school, and how they try to integrate the various instructional programs in the school. Domain 2, monitoring, teaching, and learning. This looks at the importance of both the summative and the formative monitoring of student learning, and both the summative and the formative monitoring of teaching. Domain 3, building nested learning communities, looks at opportunities for professional learning and collaboration and coaching and mentoring as well. Domain 4 is acquiring and allocating resources, which looks at how school leaders acquire and allocate resources such as time and money and expertise and community resources as well. And Domain 5 is maintaining a safe and effective learning environment, which, as the name of this domain suggests, looks at how school leaders create an an environment that's most conducive for safety, child learning, child well-being, student well-being, and teacher well-being as well. Now, we're looking at all of those domains and all the tasks within them. Again, not by focusing on the individual person and what that principal is doing, but rather we focus on the work of school leaders, looking at those tasks that make up those 5 domains. So, just to give you an idea of the difference between an individual-based assessment and an assessment that utilizes this distributed leadership model, here's a sample question from Call. Now, this question asks, which of the following best describes how well school-wide professional development activities reflect the instructional goals of the school? It's not asking about the principal. It's not even asking about a singular person and how well that person implements the PD activities. Because what we really want to know is how effective those actual activities are. Because from school to school, it could be the principal who's doing that work. It could be an assistant principal, a teacher leader, a district leader. And what we really want to know is about the impact or the effectiveness of those activities. And the response options, rather than having a standard scale for each question, in this case offers potential examples of what's happening in the school. So now when the staff and the teachers are taking the survey, they're not only providing data and feedback to their school leaders, they're also engaged in reflection, and they're thinking about their own practice. They're thinking about other activities, other work in the school, and how it impacts them as teachers. Now, when the survey is complete, there's a lot of data that comes out of it. And of course, we are in an era of being data-driven instructional leaders. And the data that you see here showing up are just some examples of the type of data that school leaders are utilizing and working with on a consistent basis. And this is great because it helps inform their decision making very efficiently. However, if the data is not presented to them in a user-friendly way, they're often left with this daunting question of, okay, well, what are we supposed to do now with all this information? So that's why when we built the Call data feedback system, we wanted to make sure that the data was going to be not only accurate and relevant, but timely, so they could use the data and inform their work, inform the school improvement planning right away, and therefore make work to incorporate progress in the school. So this is an assessment. We have a lot of assessments in schools. It could be an assessment of a student, of teachers, of principals. All these assessments we have in the schools, they all measure performance of some kind. We hope, though, that they're being used to support learning of those who are being assessed. Moreover, especially in the case of adults, we hope that that data, that information that comes out of the assessments can then be applied to one's own professional practice to consider how to improve instruction, to help student learning. And that's what we wanted to do with the Call feedback as well. This is not just an assessment to identify, areas of strength and weaknesses, but because it's formative in nature, to support the development of professionals and to promote school improvement. And here we have a quote from one of the principal investigators of Call, Professor Rich Halverson, who has done a lot of work on formative assessment and data use. And again, we want to make sure that this was going to be useful in schools. So I'm just going to take another minute to talk about how we developed Call as part of this in this project. It began as a research grant, a 4-year research grant from the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. We used that, and we began the project with this grant to develop a survey based on a set of rubrics developed by UW-Madison researchers. We then took that survey and began the process of having it be vetted by expert practitioners. And we've engaged in that iterative process really throughout the life of Call. As part of our validation study, we piloted Call in 120 schools across the country. And we looked at the resulting data to validate it against other measures of leadership effectiveness and school climate and student learning data as well. So some of the results, not to get too specific, but we have some papers to share. But we engaged in face validity work that was part of the vetting process, that to have practitioner experts come and vet the survey. We also engaged with survey design experts about inquiry and making sure that we were constructing questions appropriately. We found that even though we have non-traditional non-standard response options, that we still had high reliability and had a Cronbach alpha of above 0.7 in most areas on call. And in a paper that's in press right now for Teachers College Record, we did some latent class analysis work to identify that there are scales and that there are different tiers of schools who are rating differently on call. So that was all part of our validation work when we had our research project. And so now we're going to move on to the next section of the webinar here.
Thanks a bunch, Mark. One of the questions that this raised for me was the distinction here that you're making around what counts as or what you're actually measuring here in terms of distributive leadership. It's not just all distributive leadership. It's distributive leadership that's focused around instruction. We're correct? Instructional leadership that is distributed.
Right.
So it's a very specific thing that you all are very interested in, because I was puzzling over the 5 domains, and as you moved through your presentation, it began to kind of unfold for me that it's not just instructional leadership and it's not just distributive leadership, but it's the distribution of instructional leadership. Would you say that's fairly accurate?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that we would find that the instructional leadership can take on various forms, and and we would find that in a wide variety of areas that are distributed throughout the school, and these practices that are being measured will ultimately lead to enhanced student learning, and that's part of what that's why measuring instructional leadership in these various areas is important to do.
And then each of these 5 domains that you've identified, the learning, the monitoring, teaching and learning, the building learning communities, the acquiring resources, and the safe learning environment, all 5 of those were drawn from the research on instructional leadership and distributive leadership. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So what would be helpful now, as Mark was indicating, is for us to get a sense of then, now that this has been implemented in a number of places, and you've done a number of studies, both in the development of this tool, but then also in its use. What kinds of research questions are you asking, and what kinds of research projects are you engaged in? I believe that Marcia is going to tell us a little bit about this work. Marcia?
Yes. Hi, Michelle. Thank you. So, good afternoon. My name is Marcia Modesti. I am an assistant professor of education at Penn State, and I'm excited to talk with you about my research work with the Comprehensive Assessment of Leadership for Learning, or CALL. This slide provides a roadmap for our discussion this afternoon. I will provide a brief introduction to CALL and the purpose for using CALL in inquiry work. I will broadly describe research studies using CALL, and then go into some detail on recent CALL studies and their findings. And towards the end, I'll close by describing some next steps for our inquiry work. So as you've heard, developed by Richard Halverson and Carolyn Kelly, CALL is an online formative assessment and feedback system that measures the leadership practices that are distributed in a school or district through the work of teachers, leaders, and other school or district employees. CALL measures leadership practices through 5 domains of practice, as you see listed here. Each has 4 subdomains for a total of 20 subdomains through which the CALL items are grouped. CALL is designed to support all school leaders in establishing the conditions for improving student learning. CALL was designed to be a formative assessment that supports school-level practitioners in examining and modifying their leadership practice in schools and districts. This overarching purpose of CALL translates into our research purposes with the CALL instrument. Call inquiry work examines the resulting data and the survey itself to understand the patterns of leadership practices in schools and districts, the application of the distributed leadership conceptual framework to actual work happening in schools and districts, and the ability of call to accurately and meaningfully measure the leadership practices occurring in a range of schools and districts. Our research work with call has involved both quantitative and qualitative methods and focuses on the actual work that teachers, school leaders, and other personnel take up in their daily leadership practice. In addition, much of our early research work centered on the call survey, both the efficacy of the items to measure the constructs outlined in the survey and to understand how school leaders were using the feedback from the call survey to inform their practice in schools. Please visit the website for more information. In the time we have together, I want to share with you some findings from our recent publications and work. The two studies listed here are recent publications that examine interesting features of the call survey. The first study listed the differences across distributed leadership practices by school position, explored the relationship between a person's role in their school, in this case teachers or school leaders, and their perception of the degree to which a given leadership practice is a meaningful part of their school's daily work. The second study listed, Heeding the Call, moved beyond the more widespread construction of teacher collaboration to examine the role of instructional collaboration involving teachers and school leaders through the call survey. In addition to these recent publications, members of the call team have been working to examine other aspects of call, specifically the patterns of leadership practice across elementary and secondary schools, and the translation and implementation of call from English into Danish and the Danish context of schooling. However, today I will just focus on recent studies related to the features of call and the patterns of leadership practice across school type. The call design has built-in features that allow participants to examine leadership practices by role, specifically teacher, leaders, other personnel, and in Denmark, a fourth role is included for pedagogues, which are school professionals who support students' social and emotional well-being in addition to supporting teaching. The items measured through the subdomains and domains in call draw from the research literature on best practices in school leadership. So even though this is not a survey that focuses solely on teacher collaboration, for example, we have several items that measure these practices because they are a key part of leadership work in schools. From our initial role analysis, we found that there is a relationship between a respondent's role and their perception of the leadership practices occurring in the school. Specifically, for those items that focus more closely on the work that teachers typically engage in, for example, the formative assessment of student learning, teachers indicate that they engage in those practices at a higher rate than school leaders do for the same set of practices. Conversely, for items that examine work associated with school leaders engaging in formative assessment of teaching, school leaders indicate that they are engaging in the work at a higher rate than their teachers report for those same practices. From our instructional collaboration analysis, the findings show that there are significant relationships between school leadership practices and the extent of instructional collaboration taking place within schools, both in terms of quantity and quality. In particular, school leadership practices that are closely related to facilitating instruction and allocating resources are associated with the school's instructional collaboration, whereas leadership practice related to environmental factors tends to not be significantly correlated with the school's collaborative culture. This study also found that leadership perspectives on instructional collaboration are an important predictor of both quality and quantity for collaboration among school professionals. This is a more recent study in which my colleague Carolyn Kelly and I examined the pattern of distributed leadership practices by grade configuration for elementary and secondary schools using CALL. For this school-level analysis, we conducted a multi-level confirmatory factor analysis where the 5 call domains were factors and the subdomain scores served as indicators for the factors. When we look among the individuals that are taking the elementary and secondary versions of CALL at the within level, we see similar patterns of leadership practice for all of the domains except for Domain 2, monitoring, teaching, and learning, meaning that the subdomain scores that predict the overall domain scores load onto the domain in the same pattern across both types of schools, elementary and secondary schools. The leadership practices measured through Domain 2, monitoring, teaching, and learning, function in a unique pattern of practices across elementary and secondary schools for schools in the United States. This suggests that the leadership work of monitoring, teaching, and learning comprises an important set of practices for elementary schools and secondary schools, though they engage in this work differently. We see this clearly when we look across the various schools taking CALL or at the between level of the model. Specifically, it appears that elementary schools may prioritize the work related to student learning, followed by the evaluation of teaching. This may point to an alignment with the more student-focused approach to structuring teaching and learning in elementary schools. When we look at the patterns of leadership practice across secondary schools, we see that they may prioritize the practices associated with formative evaluation for students and teachers over summative evaluations. These practices may serve to distinguish different types of secondary schools from each other. Given the department and subject-based organization of middle schools and high schools, prioritizing the leadership practices associated with formative evaluations of student learning and teaching may support the development and mastery of practices that are best aligned to the learning needs of secondary schools from an organizational perspective. Lastly, the results from this analysis suggest that for elementary schools, managing resources is an important practice that may serve to distinguish different types of elementary schools from each other. This multi-level analysis, which accounts for the various schools taking CALL, provided us with helpful insight on how different organizations and perhaps goals of elementary schools and secondary schools may influence the type of leadership work teachers and leaders take up in their daily practice. We are interested in both qualitative and quantitative research for our next steps. Qualitatively, we are interested in doing deeper work to understand how school practitioners are interpreting and using the feedback data across both the US and Danish contexts of schooling. Because we are still in the early stages of data analysis with the Danish schools, we are interested in conducting additional quantitative analyses to deepen our understanding of leadership practice in Denmark, and thereby inform our knowledge of the policy borrowing that is happening across both countries and the CALL instrument. Thank you.
Thanks a bunch, Marcia. I think that the level of insight that you all are developing about the differences in terms of distributive leadership at the elementary school and secondary school are really interesting, but I think some of the findings around the differences within those different levels is also really kind of exciting. I don't know that our field has been able to get into this level of granularity, as you were saying, in previous times. So this is really kind of exciting.
Yes, we are excited as well, and that's really what prompted the look initially. Was this, when we looked at the literature, we saw that we didn't have a lot of comparative analyses across the two different types of schools, secondary and elementary schools, to understand how leadership may differ based on the needs of those types of organizations.
Terrific. You know, one of the questions that came up so far from the audience was, you know, where we see this particular work going in terms of as a tool for practice and as a research instrument. So one of the things that I'd like for you to be thinking about that we can come back to in the Q&A part is, you know, what is it that you all have planned? Like, you've got these different research projects that you've just described, and I know that you've got a few others that you might be able to talk about as well. But where also do you see this going? So be thinking on that, and we're going to turn to our next topic, which is to take a look at how schools are using this CALL data. Mark, you mentioned that this is a formative assessment, and you mentioned that it provides feedback not to individuals about their individual practice, but to the school itself about its work. So take us through a demonstration of the CALL web portal and what it is that schools are going to gain from this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. Happy to do that. I'm going to go to, let's see here, the CALL website. Here we are, leadershipforlearning.org, which anyone is welcome to visit. Here you go this is where you go for all things CALL, including more information about CALL, and this is where people go to take the CALL survey and to access their data. So I'm going to log in as a school leader, as a survey administrator. You can see here is where people also take the survey, but I'm going to log in as a survey administrator, enter my account. So if I were, say, a superintendent, I would see all my schools listed here. I'm going to go to one of those schools, click on Surveys and Reports, and click on View Report here. So as it loads, I want to know that one of the things we really want to make sure is that the data was going to be timely. We want to make sure that when people use CALL, that they could get their feedback right away. So the data doesn't then get sent to us in Wisconsin, where we crunch the numbers and then give a report back to the school leaders. It's all done online and generated automatically so that they can get their data right away. And that is part of the goal of having a formative feedback system, so that the data, again, can be applied to current work that they're doing, can be considering, the various initiatives they have going on, and they can. And also, one of the issues we see with assessments in general is that an assessment is given, and then the more time it takes for the data to then be calculated, the less relevant or valuable the data becomes, because so much time has passed between the administration of the assessment or the survey and the generation of the data. So as of course now, as luck would have it, this is acting a little bit slow, so I will give this just another few seconds before we consider another opportunity here, but that's all right. We'll just we'll work through it. And while we are talking about this, I want to also emphasize that there's various ways that people are using the CALL data feedback system. It's not just necessarily for a school leader's own individual purposes. We see district leaders using this as a way to understand what's happening throughout their schools, and as a way to support their school leaders as well. So this becomes a principal supervisor tool, as well as a school leadership, an individual principal tool. So here is the CALL data feedback report. What you'll see here in this sample school is that the first thing that the system does is identifies areas in need of improvement, as well as areas of strength. Now earlier, Marcia had said that there are, in addition to those 5 domains, which actually you can see listed right here, there are 4 subdomains within each of the 5 domains. And that's what you're seeing here, that any of those subdomains can be pulled out, and the system identifies as either an area in need of improvement or an area of strength. So that's one thing that is helpful to school leaders, is that they can identify and use this as a needs assessment to determine where should we be focusing our time and energy going forward. So there's different ways to cut into the data. One would be just to look in these different areas in need of improvement and areas of strength. Another could be just to start with any of these 5 domains, opening them up by clicking on Show Subdomains, and seeing those subdomains within them, and looking to see how the various roles that have taken the survey have rated. We have teachers, administrators, and support staff. These were the units of analysis that Marcia and I used when we did our paper on comparing CALL results according to school roles. And so we can look at the data this way by opening up one domain at a time and looking at the subdomains, or we can just start up at the top and pick one of these areas of strength or areas in need of improvement and go directly to that. So I'm going to go to this 2.4, the summative evaluation of teaching, and go to View Subdomain, and that will just take me down the page and open up Domain 2 and take me to this subdomain. And I now can look at our school's rating in comparison to the call average, which is all schools that have used call. And I should say that we are continuing to make tweaks and improvements to the system to have the call average be more representative of the schools that are being compared to. So for example, comparing rural high schools to rural high schools and urban elementary schools to urban elementary schools. That is in process. But in the meantime, here's what this is just one way to cut into the data. And we can look at this subdomain and ask, well, okay, we see how our teachers, administrators, and support staff have rated, and we can see our school rating here. We want to know, well, what exactly is going on in the subdomain? What is 2.4, the summative evaluation of teaching? Well, to find that out, I'm going to click on View Item Details, and that will take me to this page. And this is all of the questions in this subdomain 2.4, the summative evaluation of teaching, and I can see each survey item and see its rating, and all ratings on call is on a 5-point scale. And then I can also see a distribution of responses for each question. And this is valuable because I can see where is a school, where we have our experiences, what our different perceptions are. We can look at questions where there's a high concentration on one side of the spectrum or the other. But we also might want to look at questions where there's more of an even distribution of responses. For example, this question is asking about how results from teacher evaluations are being used in your school. And 13 people in this school said they're not being used at all, they're not collected. 18 people said, well, yes, they are being used. They're collected and used to set goals and evaluate progress. So as a school leader, I might look at this question and say, we've got different experiences that different teachers are having, and we may need to take a closer look at what's going on here. We might want to consider, what do we do with results from teacher evaluations? And why are our different teachers have different experiences? Do they know what we do with these results, or do they just think it's just for compliance purposes? Also, please recall that all of the questions are task-based. They're about particular activities. For example, having a pre-observation meeting between the school leaders and the teachers. So we can look to the questions individually to identify very discrete tasks and to consider what we might want to do differently. Observations and post-observation meetings as well, as this question is asking. It's all action-oriented, and it gives us an idea of what's happening in the school and what we might want to consider doing as far as instituting change in the school. This is just for this subdomain, the summative evaluation of teaching. We can dig more deeply into all of the areas of call by looking at each subdomain individually. And we can drill down into the item level details, and that's where I think we'd find the most value. Now, one of the last things I wanted to show you about this is that we said this is again, this is a tool that's meant to support those who are being assessed, specifically school leaders and school leadership in the school. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to go now to just domain 1, focus on learning, open it up, and take a look at subdomain 1.1, maintaining a school-wide focus on learning. And so let's say we looked at our data, we looked at our school's rating, we looked at the different roles, the teachers, the administrators, the support staff. We drill down into the item level details, and we have an idea of what specific tasks we could do differently. But what if we were in need of more support and more ideas of ways to make some changes in our school? Well, I'm going to click on View Feedback for 1.1, maintaining a school-wide focus on learning. And here we are with feedback for that subdomain. And first we get an introduction of how to use this feedback, and we also get a description of what this subdomain is, so people could have a better idea of what it is that's being assessed here. And now we can go to Show Feedback for this subdomain, and we can get some strategies and suggestions for improvement, some actual steps, research-based steps that school leaders and district leaders could implement into a school. And now school leadership teams have an opportunity to reflect on these steps and consider, are we doing this? Why or why not? And if we are, is it working? What could we be doing differently? This is all research-based strategies that was developed at the University of Wisconsin, led by Professor Carolyn Kelly, another principal investigator on the project. And what I just did there is I clicked on a PDF resource that is a tool that's offered to the school leaders, again, just for this subdomain 1.1, and they can use this now in their schools. This is building a shared vision, a resource for building a shared vision, a resource for building shared vision as well, an agenda building, I'm sorry, as well. And these are resources we include in the feedback system, all for the purpose of making sure that those who are being assessed in the school are being provided with support. And this becomes a school improvement tool. And we see schools using this in a variety of ways as part of the school improvement planning process, as part of let's say they have an evaluation system, educator effectiveness, for example, where they might be required to do a school improvement plan, but also to show examples of leadership effectiveness in their schools. Various ways that CALL is being used. And what I just showed you is, just the beginning, and there's different ways they can be used and different ways to consider the data. But I'll pause here because I wanted to make sure we have enough time for Jen as well. And certainly I invite you to visit the website, leadershipforlearning.org, and you can dig around and even see a report yourself if you'd like.
Thanks a bunch, Mark. Much appreciated. And we have a couple of questions that have popped up based on some of the things you just presented, but we'll return to those right after we have a chance to talk with Jennifer. And Jennifer, I know that you have been using the CALL in your leadership preparation program, so we're real interested in knowing what you see as the utility and implications for using CALL in your work.
Great. First of all, thank you. I'm happy to be here and have an opportunity to talk about this. And exactly that. So we at the University of Connecticut have begun to integrate this tool into our work in training leaders. I guess I'll give you a little bit of background first. The Lead Connecticut UCAPP Residency is in its second year of existence. It's one of 3 models of principal preparation program offered by the NEOG School at UConn. It's a partnership between the university and Lead Connecticut, which is a state organization focused on leadership development in Connecticut districts. The charge of the residency is actually to train high-quality principals for our state's lowest performing schools. It's a 1-year training program aligned to state and national standards, which leads to a 6-year degree in ed leadership and an opportunity to become a certified administrator in Connecticut upon successful completion of our state exam. So the structure of the program is delineated here out on this slide. 4 days a week, which is 80% of time. The actual resident principals who are selected for the program work under the guidance and supervision of a mentor principal selected in conjunction or with collaboration between myself and the district superintendent. The residency component of the program makes it unique among the 3 models of training programs we do have at the University of Connecticut, and that is supplemented with 1 full day, which amounts to about 6 hours of in-class instruction weekly. There are other components here, such as the coaching that they get not only from the mentor principal, but from me in my role as coordinator. I visit the sites approximately every 2.5 weeks and have the opportunity to see the residents in work, live time, answer questions, observe them working, and then provide feedback. And we have several meetings a year with the mentor principals to update progress and have used consistently new leaders as a consultation group to enhance various aspects of our program. The components of the program are delineated on the next slide. And there are far more than this, but the ones that are really appropriate in having this conversation around CALL are set forth here in front of you. First and foremost, the program itself is based upon the Lead Connecticut Turnaround Principle Framework, and that essentially is 13 competencies, delineated by members of the state Department of Education, people from the university, other people in Connecticut who are very prominent in the field of educational leadership, and they are the competencies that have been determined to be the most significant factors necessary to impact low-performing schools. And so those competencies serve as the basis of the one-year training program. The core areas of instruction are focused solely around those competencies and really fall into 4 areas. Talent management, which really focuses on the observation, supervision, and development of staff. Instructional leadership, which focuses heavily on the use of data to improve instructional practice. Organizational leadership, creating theories of action, understanding change management, having a vision for the work of your leadership, and personal leadership. So what is it that you bring to the table in becoming a leader of one of these schools? Along with the instructional practice, the program really consists of 4 core program assessments that are iterative and are done throughout the course of the entire year. So as an example, the talent management assessment requires the resident principals to submit 6 full cycle observations along with individual growth plans for the teachers that they're supervising, and then a reflection as to how the experience went by the end of the year, and documented evidence of growth in teacher practice over time. One of the other core assessments that we are now administering as part of this program in year 2 is a competency assessment, which I will talk a little bit more about in a moment, which really couples itself with the use of the call. So the uniqueness, and this is really presented on the next slide, the uniqueness of the residency program in the area that folks at UConn feel that the Lead Connecticut UCAPP residency is best suited to influence other training programs, both locally and nationally, is in the area of assessment. So if you'd like to switch that slide, Mark. Right. So the competency assessment, I talked about the 4 performance-based measures, and the most important thing to take away from that is that we are actually measuring the resident principal doing the work of leadership. The competency assessment is a measure of the resident's progress and performance on the Lead Connecticut turnaround competencies. This assessment is administered both pre and post program, so that in the beginning of the program it helps us develop an individualized leadership plan for each resident, and by the end of the program any progress that the resident has made on this assessment is a document not only of their growth over time, but ultimately is a measure of program effectiveness. We have begun to use, in collaboration with Mark and the other people at the University of Wisconsin, the call measure in a very meaningful and strategic way in conjunction with the competency assessment. The call measure is implemented or administered to each school where there is a resident principal in the fall. At that time, that measure provides a baseline data set for our residents as to leadership gaps in the school. This becomes critically important because as residents are asked to create individualized leadership plans, they are asked to use the results of the call to determine what areas they will focus on in their instructional leadership work throughout the course of the year. Ultimately, the call is administered again in the spring, and at that time, we are able to assess how much of an impact the resident has had on their training site by virtue of modifying some of the initial questions. And I'll talk about that a little bit more deeply as you move ahead. I'm showing you here a snapshot of the competency assessment scoring rubric. As you can see, okay, the competency assessment is actually comprised of 3 separate modules. There is an instructional analysis task where the resident principal is asked to observe a module of teaching, provide feedback around what they saw in the form of a role play, acting as an administrator, okay, in what would be typical of a post-conference in a regular school site anywhere across the country. Within this 4-point rubric, identified there are some of the key skills that underline the competencies that we feel, the state of Connecticut feels, are necessary for leaders to be able to turn around low-performing schools. This is actually a strength profile for one of the residents that I have in the program this year that was garnered in the beginning or pre-program from this particular student. The competency assessment is slated to be administered in 2 weeks from now as a post-program measure, and we hope that some of the areas levels of proficiency, as demonstrated here, will move from 1s and 2s to 3s and 4s across the board. But you can see we have actually placed each resident in their skill set into a 4-point rubric for measurement. Next, secondarily, we've decided that we wanted to use that particular competency measure in conjunction with another measure that was more a measure of what was happening in the identified training site. So now we know from the competency measure where our resident principals' strengths and weaknesses are, but what we really want to try to do is match those up to the current reality of the school in which they are training. So we chose to work with Mark in the University of Wisconsin specifically because the measure has already been obviously empirically based and validated and serves as a very strong baseline measure of leadership gaps in the training site schools. In the spring, when we modify the assessment a little bit, we also will have another viable data set, which is how much of an impact did those residents have on their training site. So in the general administration, which is the fall administration of the call, this is a sample item, similar to the sample item Mark showed you, of what we would expect every single teacher in the school building to fill out. So they will be asked something along the lines of, how often do school leaders participate in classroom visits or learning walks to improve instruction? This one item is one of several hundred that become the baseline data from which the resident principals are able to develop and design individualized leadership plans. In the spring, we modify the assessment to focus specifically on the work of the resident principal. So you will see that while the question is almost identical to what you just saw, there is a focus this time on an individual. And this is a little bit of a deviation from what the measure was initially intended to do, but I was able to work with the University of Wisconsin team to make this a viable option for us. Not only do we get to see resident impact on site, these residents now have a data set to bring with them on an interview process that has evidence, qualitative evidence and quantitative evidence as to what they did throughout the course of their training had an impact on kids. And that, I think, is one of the most innovative, unique things that comes from our relationship and our work with the people who have established the call. So in essence, what happens is we have, in addition to the 4 core assessments that I described to you before, we have what's known as the Lead Connecticut UCAPP Residency Individualized Leadership Project. Okay? The residents take the results of their competency assessment from the fall and they cross-reference it with the results of the call administration from the fall. And they design for the instructors a project which addresses not only one of their personal growth areas, but also an area in which there is a leadership gap in the school. And so an example from this year would be, and it's quite simple and very straightforward, is I have a resident principal this year who has not had a tremendous amount, or did not up until the training program, have a tremendous amount of experience in providing feedback to teachers around instructional practice. On her competency assessment, some of her weaker scores came in the instructional analysis module when she was asked to provide feedback around an instructional video of instruction. Her call results for her building indicated that her teachers felt that they were not receiving adequate feedback, consistent and quality, around their instructional practice. So the individualized leadership project for this particular resident really entails providing significant amounts of feedback around the quality of instruction in classrooms over the course of the year. It is very detailed. There are due dates for certain things, and obviously it's far more finite than I'm describing here, but the most important thing is that you understand the relationship between how we're using the competency assessment results, which are a measure of personal skill, against the measure of what is happening as a current reality of the school using the call. In the spring, the residents take both the competency assessment and re-administer the call to their buildings. With that, they have then a viable data set that shows not only their growth over time as measured by the competency assessment, but they also have a data set that supports that the work that they did was actually impactful to the training site and for the students that they served.
Thanks, Jennifer. So the competency assessment that you mentioned, this is something in addition to the call, is that correct?
It
so
is.
then that way you have the call for the school-wide assessment of how well distributive leadership is working around instructional leadership, but then you have these individualized competencies so that you can get a sense of how the individual is participating as a member of that distributive leadership team.
Exactly, yes. Yep.
Okay. I'm just wondering, have you had any unintended consequences? Anything that you didn't necessarily anticipate using the call data for, or that the call got used in a way that you didn't necessarily expect?
Yeah, I guess my answer to that would be one of the most a very positive yet unintended consequences that I have seen in this year in particular. We have 10 resident principals. I have seen in 8 out of 10 of the schools that we are working with this year, the principals actually using and owning this as a viable data set for school improvement processes. That wasn't necessarily part of the deal, so to speak, going into our relationship with the principals this year, other than that it needed to be administered and utilized through the lens of the resident principal. But I have 8 mentor principals who have now taken ownership of this data and are using this data as part of their school improvement planning processes. So I think that they see this, especially because it's administered to the teacher, to the entire staff, they see this as a very marked, clear understanding of what the perception of leadership distribution is in the buildings. And they have taken to using this in ways that have really expanded well beyond what our initial, the intended outcome was. So I was able to watch a resident principal actually share the data set at a meeting, a school staff meeting in the fall, and I will be able to go back and see her share the data set when she administers it in 2 weeks as a follow-up with the staff at the end of year staff meeting. So she can tie the results from the fall to the spring very clearly together for the staff, and which also validates them spending the time to take the assessment, right? But also, I think there's a tremendous amount of ownership that principals are taking to the data beyond that which the resident principal has.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jennifer. We are pretty much out of time, but there were 2 questions that are very much related to the survey instrument itself that I felt like we really probably want to try to get answered. Mark, before we close up shop, and I just want to assure everyone that if you asked a question, that we will share your question with the call team so that they can respond to you directly. But these 2 questions, one of them comes from Linda Hartzer and another from James Buchanan, and the one from Linda is that you mentioned that teachers respond differently according to their participation in specific leadership roles, and might some of the responses results of questions be based more on perception, even knowing that perception influences reality. And then the second question, which is not too dissimilar, is from James, and it's the call relies on self-reported information, correct? If so, the survey items are the survey items low inference / high discrimination, so that the researcher can determine the veracity of the responses. Mark, can you take that and answer it in like a 1 to 2 minute period? I know I'm
Sure.
asking a lot.
Yeah, I think that's an opportunity for a longer discussion, as you're insinuating, and I just to try to touch upon those two. Yes, I mean, the whole, with surveys, I mean, I think that the challenge is that the survey takers, specifically the teachers, are offering their perception, but we recognize that we just wanted to make sure that it was drawing upon their experiences, regards to the work that they're doing and other activities, routines, other work that impacts them. So if they are drawing upon their perception based on their own experience as teachers in the classroom, and we even ask about what they do in the classroom, how they collaborate with other teachers, how they work with other specialists. So we wanted to get away from focusing on trait-based inquiry, focusing on where people might take into consideration their personal feelings around other people. That's the kind of perception-based questions we wanted to avoid. But if it's perception that's based on their experience and their reality in terms of teaching and instructional leadership, that's what we wanted to go for. Regarding the second question about self-reporting and the veracity of the items based on that, of course we cannot ever ensure that one person is answering it quote-unquote correctly, but when we get hundreds of people within a school district and thousands of participants across the country, we can start to find definite trends, response patterns. That was a large part of what our validation work was about. So we are able to identify, those questions that are consistently low or consistently high, and obviously take that into consideration as part of a larger analysis. There's different work that researchers do aside from the data feedback system. So those are kind of two different animals there. So there's probably more to talk about, but I'm also sensitive to the time, and I welcome any further conversation after the webinar as well.
Terrific. So unfortunately, we've reached the end of today's webinar on the call instrument. But I think, as we mentioned previously when Marcia was presenting some of the research in progress and some of the findings that they have so far, they have a lot of really interesting work going on, including some international comparative work going on in Denmark. And it may just be that we end up holding another webinar that focuses just specifically on some of this interesting research. But I just want everyone to thank me and welcoming join me in thanking our webinar presenters today. And I'd just like to thank all of you, Mark, Marcia, and Jennifer. It was very, very informative. I feel like I learned a great deal from this time. I'd also like to thank those of you who sent in some really terrific questions. We appreciate that most definitely. And as I mentioned, if we didn't get to your question, the call team will be contacting you directly with their responses. And if you have a question that you didn't get a chance to post, you can send them to us, and we will make sure that that they get answered. Now, one final reminder. We will be having a full recording of this discussion within a few days, available on the UCEA website or through the UCEA YouTube channel, and we encourage you to share it with your colleagues who could not be here with us today. With that being said, a final thank you to all of you, and a goodbye, and have a pleasant week.
Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you especially to Michelle and Marcy for hosting and inviting us to be on this webinar today. We very much appreciate it, and we look forward to further conversations down the line.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much. This was really great.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.